Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is John, also known as Megahertz. Today I'm going to begin building my 2D player controller using Bolt Visual Scripting. In a previous video I showcased what I built, which I think is pretty robust. Be sure to check that out if you hadn't already done so. In the second part of that video I also show how to set up Bolt, Cinemachine, and Universal Render Pipeline, because we're going to be using all three of those add-ons in this build. If you want to follow along with what I'm doing, I would highly recommend checking out that video first. A quick note on what you see in your screen. I've already set up kind of a playground level so that we can test our player controller once we start implementing things. I've also taken the liberty of including that package file in the description if you want to follow along. Just download it, import it into your folder or into your Unity scene, and let it do its thing. Then click on, go to Scenes and click on Level 1. And it should bring up what you see here. Now, I'm not going to show how to make a level using tile palettes. I've already mentioned in a previous video where I learned how to do it, as well as a link to that video. I'll put that in the description again. Instead, I'm going to focus on the Bolt side of things. These are the macros that we're going to be building today. We're going to begin with a simple movement controller. And then we're going to have to decide whether we want to use velocity, whether we want to use force, or whether we want to use transform position. There are benefits to each one of these things, and there are drawbacks to each one of these. And we're also going to set up a sprint function. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to set up a new folder and call it sprites. And trust me, you're going to want to go through this step because things get pretty complex very quickly. Do another folder, call it player. And if you're feeling ornery, just go ahead and do one more folder and put idle. But once you get that set up, we're going to import our sprites. I've already shown in the previous video where I got these from. These are online, these are for free. I can't just give them to you because there's an opportunity for the guy to get a donation. Just import those 4 files in. What we're going to do next is we're going to take these and we're going to set all the pixels per unit to 25. And what that is going to do is it's going to make the sprites a little bit larger. Just go ahead and drag the first one into your scene. Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to rename this that we drug into our scene. We're just going to rename that player. And then we're going to go add some components to it. Go ahead and add a rigid body 2D. Once you add that, be sure to go to constraints and freeze the position on the Z. Otherwise, it will flip over, and we don't want that to happen. Next, we're going to go to a capsule collider. And you may be wondering, why am I using a capsule collider instead of a box collider? Well, if you have a completely flat level with no edges or anything, you can totally use a box collider. But with a capsule collider, go ahead and edit that. With a capsule collider, you have the ability to kind of make the edges a little bit smoother. So as you're running up steps, for example, it doesn't sit there and hang up on the steps. It just moves over that circle that you see right there. So just go ahead and try to get that the way that you're happy with it. Make sure that that capsule collider is offset to 0. That you cannot, it's going to give you serious problems if the X is anything other than that. So just get to where you're happy with it, and then we'll move on. Next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to go back to your player controller, your assets folder, and then create another folder and call it macros. And inside this one, just go ahead and do another one and create one called player. And then inside this, I would strongly recommend this because there are a lot of macros for your player. Just go ahead and type in another folder called movement. Then we're going to go to our player and we're going to add a state machine. So go to add component state machine. And under that, let's create a new state machine macro. Go to player controller, macros, and just set this under player because this is kind of your master player state machine. Just call this one player, and it should bring up a graph. Looks just like that. Just go ahead and delete that. We're going to create a new super state, and we're going to call that one non-combat. Okay, under the non-combat macro, we're going to just rename this one to master. And go ahead and open that up, and then we're going to delete all of this. We'll be grabbing things when we need it. Next, go to our movement folder and then create a new flow macro, and we're going to call this movement. Next, we're going to go to our player, and then we're going to add some variables. So right up here in variables, you should see that once you add the state machine. Go ahead and type 1 speed and make that a float. And go ahead and set it to 3. You can change that later to whatever you want. Another one called run speed. Not speed. How about that? Set this to floats and set it to 8. Then we're going to set in a couple bools. So we're going to do sprinting. Yeah, spell that right? Sprinting, I think. No, I did not spell that right. I'm having a fun day. Sprinting. Then we're going to set that as a bool, and then last one we're going to make moving. And this is all for mainly for our animator, if you're wondering. Just leave those false. Okay, there's one more step before we actually start working on our macros. We're going to need to add an animator to our player, so just go ahead and add an animator component to your player. We're going to create that in just a second. Go to player controller, and under that create one more folder, call it animation. Sorry, 2 more folders. Create another folder called player, and this is where we're going to set that animation. So going under our animation, we're going to create, and we're going to set up an idle animation. We're going to do that under player, and then we're going to drag in those sprites. So we're going to go find player idle sprites. I believe you're going to need these right here, one of each of these. Get those selected. And I believe if you set that to 10, it should look about right. Whoops, I got the wrong one there. So I was having a problem with my idle animation with the sword on the last frame. And this is why it's helpful to have things like a sprite. He gives you that file. If you were to play those 4 frames, this is what it looks like in idle. And if I wanted to, I could re-download that just by turning on the weapon there and just re-importing that. If you don't have a sprite, that's fine. We'll just do it with the idle animation without the sword. Okay, once I get all the idle animations imported into Unity, make sure that you set that to 25 on each one of those. And now I should have an idle animation with no sword. If that's a little fast for you, you can slow it down by lowering the number or speed it up by making it faster. Okay, let's go ahead and navigate back to our macros, player, movement, and movement macro. And I'm gonna go ahead and show you how to build this first one. If this is your first time working Bolt, this is pretty easy, but I can understand it might look a little complicated. Let's go ahead and right click on the screen here and type in input, and we're gonna need the input in nesting. When you click on that, we're going to give that a control input, and it's going to, let's just call it input. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a sequence here. And the reason we're adding a sequence is because we need 2 things to happen at once. So as soon as that's finished compiling that list, it'll give me a sequence, okay? We're going to leave that at 2. And then we're going to go up here, and then we're going to get axis raw. Instead of just get axis raw is supposed to be a little bit more precise, so we're going to use that horizontal, type that in. Then we're going to copy and paste that right down here. The reason why we're doing this is because we need a left and we need a right, and we need it going in 2 different directions. So go ahead and drag an arrow out here, go to branch. Okay, and we're going to need, whenever the x-axis is less than 0, then it's going to be on the negative on the x-axis. So when it's less than 0, then we're going to be moving left. Let's go ahead and copy this branch, place it right down here, and then we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to do greater. When the x-axis is greater than 0, then we're going to want to go right. Okay, we're going to go ahead and set up our sprint check now, because we will be using that before the end of this video. If you click on your player, you're going to have to navigate back to that, go to master, and just drop the movement in there, so that now when we click on our player, it won't go anywhere. And so just double click that movement and open that right back up, and navigate to your variables. And if you will hold, you'll click the, that's not the right one. We need sprinting. If you just grab that and drag that in, we should have that now. So what we're going to need is one more. See what? Let's get these two real quick. Just copy and select those, paste them, and then we're going to have to do this one twice. So let's copy and paste. I'm going to run each of these into this next branch. Okay, in order to keep things nice and neat, I really recommend adding these into groups. You can do that by holding your control and dragging with your mouse, and just select the parts that you want to group. And then we're going to call this direction check. And if it's inquiring about something, I don't know why, I think it should be yellow, so you can change that to whatever color you want. And here we're going to do a sprint check. So is the player moving? Is the player sprinting? Okay, so we're going to call that sprint check, and then I'm going to make that yellow. So this should be pretty self-explanatory. Let me just try to explain what's going on. Whenever we have an input of flow coming in, we're going to see if we're moving left or right. So this is left, this is right, because this is negative, and that's going to be positive. Then we're going to check and say, is our player's moving left? Is our player sprinting? Because if they're holding the sprint button, which we'll set up, then we're going to need to give it the sprint speed. If it's not, then we're going to have to give it the walk speed. We're actually going to have 4 different elements of speed here, but 2 are for the left and 2 are for the right. Okay, for the next part of this, you're going to want to figure out what you want to use. Whether you want to use force, whether you want to use velocity, or whether you want to use transform position. I'll show you the difference on each one of those. For now, just go ahead and grab, just by clicking your variable, you can grab it and just drag it in. I've done that for run speed and speed on both our left and our right. I meant to include one more thing before we could test our movement. We're going to have to go to player, let's get this out. Go to player, non-combat, master, and then add an update. And we're going to actually have to decide, because they will be different. We're gonna have to do update or fixed update depending on which direction we go from here, but just go ahead and run that into movement. Okay, just really quickly, I've gone ahead and set up a move variable force on our player here, and so you should be able to see some movement now. The difference, one of the things you need to notice about this, and this might be exactly what you're going for, is that when you hit left, and I set the speed to 5 because it needs to be a little bit higher, it takes a little bit to get started using force, and once you're started, let me tell you when I'm letting off the controller. I'm letting off right now. You notice it still kind of slides, and that might be exactly what you're looking for. Okay, here I've set up the same thing using velocity, and if you'll notice, it takes a lot less time to get started, but a lot longer to slow down. And so you really, again, you're going to have to decide which direction you want to go as far as movement. This does not really give us a very tight controller. It makes it kind of feel like you're walking on ice. Now, the way that you get around doing maybe a tighter controller without that icy feeling is to set up something that looks a little bit like this down here. Let me see if I can get this out of here. Okay, so I'm going to I have the same thing set up, but I have it to where it's always updating something. You notice that it feels a lot tighter, and that's great. The problem is, and the reason why I don't like this setup, is because when we want to start adding velocity to the X, like say for example we jump up on a wall and we want to throw ourselves out, it's not going to work because our velocity is always being set to 0. Same thing with force if we wanted to do that. So one or the other, either velocity or force, is always being negated, and the only way you can get this tight feeling is to run your input into your velocity at all times. And I don't like that, so I recommend using transform. So let me go ahead and set that up. Okay, and now have transform set up. So this is the same thing except for the transform feature. If you notice, you get a pretty tight movement, and you don't get that icy feeling, and it's only firing the movement whenever you press the button. So that's the one I prefer. Now let me show you how to set these up real quick. So these things pretty easy to set up if you just look at the picture. The one thing I would note, this is the variable force. On the input, what you're going to do is you're going to give it a control input, and then you're going to give it 2 value inputs, and you're going to set those to default. So I have multiplier, float has default value, and just leave it to 0 right there. And the same thing with speed. And the reason why you do that is so that whenever you come out, let's say you can set it right here if you want. So the multiplier needs to be -1 if you're going left on the x-axis. It needs to be +1 if you're going right on the x-axis. So variable force and velocity are pretty much the same, except for you're changing that one thing there. But that's how you set up those multiplier and speed in the macro for inputs. So you can plug it in from the outside. Transform looks like this. Let me just basically explain what's happening here and why this works. So you're coming into the input, you're setting the position whenever it's trying to move, and you use a function called lerp. And so what that does is it moves according to frame, which is what you have here, the delta time.delta time. Basically what we're saying is we're multiplying our speed times our direction, whichever one we're going in, negative or positive, and then we're going to set that to the x. We get the position of the player, and then we add that x value to it, and then we transform where we currently are to where we want to be by time.delta time, and that will give us that lerp function. Let me show you what happens whenever we don't use this lerp function. You will most likely fly off the screen. Let me see if that's what happens here. Yeah, see, you'll have like that darting function. So that time.delta time is very important, and that just gives it to where it's only adding it every frame. Okay, the next thing we're going to need to do, you might not necessarily want this in your game, but a good sprint function is pretty versatile, so we're going to go ahead and set that up real quick. We already have a sprint check here. Again, if you don't want to sprint in your game, just take out that whole section and just run it into your run speed. So you don't even, or I think this one is the sprint. So get rid of this one and just use your speed. You can do it that way. Let's go ahead and set up a sprint check though. So go ahead and go to this folder, go to Bolt, create a flow macro, and call it SprintCheck. Okay, this one is not going to be real difficult to set up. Just go ahead and follow the picture. I'm gonna go ahead and make it real quick, just to give us a little bit more practice. In the future, I'm not going to be going all the way through because it does make the videos longer. So just do an input there, input, get button. And we're gonna check for the sprint button, which we're gonna have to set that up in just a second. Sprint. And then we're going to go into a branch. This is a true-false statement. If you're not aware of what a branch is, what we're checking, is it true or is it false? All right, and then we're going to click on our player. Actually, instead of doing that, let's just go to add set variable. And I believe we already made that. So we're going to do an object variable here, and we're going to check for sprinting. Sprinting, and copy and paste this again. And then we're going to need 2 bool units, so bool, literal, or boolean, and then copy and paste that again. And this one's going to be true, this one's going to be false. Just go ahead and run those into this bottom value right here. And so if the sprint button is being pressed, then we're going to say sprint. If it's not being pressed, then we're going to say don't worry about it. So just go ahead and run that right in there, and let's go ahead and set up our sprint button. If you go up to edit, project settings, you should have input manager that comes in. I think I already set mine up. Yes, I already did. So if this says 30, which I think is what it starts out saying, just add 31 and then add sprint up here on the top. Just type in sprint. You can either do this in negative button or positive button. I just did negative. Just type in lowercase left space shift. Down here you need key or mouse button on the X axis, and then you should be set up and ready to go. Now the last thing that we need to do just really quickly is we need to go to our let's see, player non-combat master. Oops. And right here we're going to break that, and then we're going to add a sequence can spell it right. All right, and then we're going to, I'm actually going to change this to a fixed update because you typically want to run a fixed update for anything physics-based, which even though we're transforming position, we are going to be doing wall jumps and things like that with this controller. And then the next thing we're going to do is just going to drag that sprint check right here, and we are going to test it out and see if it works. Okay, now I've got it started up, and we should be able to move left and right, and when we hold our shift button or our sprint button, whichever you have it set to, you should notice that he moves a little bit faster than normal. So should be working for you. Okay, before I end this video, let me just quickly try to answer a question that you might be asking yourself. If transform position is so good, why would we ever want to use anything different? Well, the short answer is that it takes a little bit more to set up with transform position, and I'll get into that in just a second. Another reason that people might not like this is because if you notice, there's not really any slow down or speed up time. He just kind of moves where we want him to go. Again, people might not like that because it's not very realistic. And of course, my response to that would be, well, neither is killing undead monsters and, skeletons that are walking around. So to each his own. I personally like this because I think it feels tighter as far as the controller goes. I know that a lot of really good 2D platformer games do not use physics in moving their players. So, to each his own. You can use this if you want. You don't have to. A big drawback of setting up a transform position, and the alert function does actually help with this. We have this lerp in here that he's not transforming through the wall, but just depending on how fast you go and how thin the wall is, it is possible to do that. So what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to set up some wall colliders. So we're gonna do that in the next video. We're gonna go ahead and set up our collision colliders for a wall and also for the ground so that we get our grounded function. This is going to give us the ability to not only jump, but set up a good wall jump function in the videos to come. So thanks for joining me. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully see you in the next video. Thanks.